blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls...
Well, good morning, America. Welcome to Connecting the Dots. It's June 4th, and I can't believe the year's gone this quickly, but we are moving right along, and we've had a few technical difficulties over the last couple of weeks. I think we've got those issues resolved, but in any case, we are now talking about, today we're going to have a program with Mary Fanning and Alan Jones, and we are going to be talking about globalism, feudalism, corporatism, and technocracy. And this is really what we've been talking about for the last 2.5 years, but we've been connecting the dots for people. And today we are going to be talking about just exactly what's been happening to this country and how we have been herded literally into globalism, and how we are really losing our country to the idea of a globalist socialist technocracy. And we need to make sure that our young people and our people in this country understand what's happening, and that's exactly what this program is all about. Mary Fanning and Alan Jones have joined me a number of times over the last 2 years, and they are really terrific people, have a very good understanding of what's going on in the security world. They write for, they're investigative journalists for the Center for Security Policy. And they also, Mary Fanning has started and really is the head of a group called the Coalition of Concerned Citizens. So what we've got going on in this country needs to be paid attention to, because everybody in La Land needs to understand we are losing the essence of our beautiful republic, our Constitution. Everything is going down the tubes if we don't stand up and really support what this country is all about. So with that, Mary, welcome to the radio program, and thank you for being our guest today, and the same with you, Alan, and I'll start the conversation with Mary.
Dan, it's so nice to be with you. It always is. Thank you for having us.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm really looking forward to this program because we've been connecting the dots for a long time, but you and I have talked off air about this, and the reality is what's been happening over the last 2.5 years under the Trump administration and the level of resistance that the president has gotten from the deep state, and there is a deep state, and it's real, and it is a globalist transformation of America, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And Mary, I can't think of anybody that has a better handle on that than you and Alan.
That's very nice, Dan. Thank you. We're watching. There were things that were being put in place, such as the Patriot Act, that made much of what has happened under the Obama administration possible. people understand that Barack Obama came in, and he made some transformative changes. Remember Barack Obama, when he first came in, he said he was going to transform America. No one voted for him to come in and transform America. Most people liked America just the way it was, with its constitutional freedoms, a land that believed in freedom, property rights, free speech. But Barack Obama came in, and he came in to change that, to destroy all that, if you will. Remember when he first was talking to a plumber, and the man was talking about his business. He said, "You didn't build that." Well, people's antennas went up because they understood that to mean there's no more individualism. This is about the collective. This is about the state. This is about communism.
Well, and Mary, that's where we've been heading for a long time. I mean, this has gone on through, really through most of the administrations, including Bush 1 and Bush 2, Clinton. It's been going on for a long time, and what it boils down to is that there's no pun intended, a collective belief that we need to move into a global socialist collectivist state, and that capitalism has to be destroyed because we can't live under capitalism any longer. There's a belief that we are destroying the earth, and a lot of this, what it really boils down to is there's a handful of very, very, very powerful families that have controlled everything for a long time. And what we are moving into is a new corporate feudalism where a handful of people control everything. And that's really what this is all about, isn't it?
It is. I would disagree with you a little bit. I don't think it's about socialism. I think it's about communism.
Well, it is
hardcore communism.
Yeah.
And when people understand history, they understand. It's very interesting. The Central Committee. It's talking about the collective. Not the rights of the individual, but and then the language continues to morph. Notice that communists always make sure that once you start to catch on, they change the language. I'm no longer a communist, I'm a progressive. Well, watch out, because all they're going to progress to is hardcore communism. And this truly is the last bastion of freedom under the U.S. Constitution, where we the people actually makes a difference. It's not just a Central Committee who tells you that you can have one baby, and by the way, we'll take away number 2, 3, and 4 and kill them, as they do in China. And so understand, if we lose freedom here, it will not be the soft socialism or soft communism that's being put in place in Europe right now. It instead will be the hardcore communism of North Korea. If the lights go out here, they will go out everywhere. Everywhere.
Yeah, I agree. It's and you're right. It is communism, and in reality, communism isn't even the final answer. The final answer is a feudalist technocracy where we own nothing and we are all just controlled by the lords who will have everything, and we will have nothing.
Yeah, as we watch some of the things that are happening, it's so curious. We broke a story recently, and the verbiage was picked up many places, because it told that in the New Yorker, James Comey told, "I used to be a communist. I don't know what I am now." Adding that together with the fact that we had John Brennan, who from a very young age was supporting, communism, and in fact the first man to run Gus Hall, that John Brennan was supporting him for office. We have had Barack Obama's mentor from his youth, from his formative years in Hawaii, Frank Marshall Davis, who was a communist, card-carrying communist, a Soviet agent working for the Soviet Union. The people who, under the Obama administration, took control of our government were steeped in communism.
And that's the nature of the deep state, Mary. The nature of the deep state is to fill all these positions with like-minded, useful idiots of the left and get them in positions of power where they can make administrative decisions that ultimately end up being the law of the land. And that's really what's been happening. And you're right. You take a look at Brennan, you take a look at Comey, you take a look at Clapper, you take a look at all the people who have been at the very apex of our national security structure, and a large part of them are admittedly communists.
I'm not sure it's just a large part of them. We look to Leon Panetta, who was a CIA director, Leon Panetta, who was a Secretary of Defense. Leon Panetta had been exposed as working in league with Hugh DeLacy. Hugh DeLacy was outed as a Chinese silver master, as a congressman, and when his documents were found at the University of Washington Library, it proved that he and Hugh DeLacy, that Leon Panetta and Hugh DeLacy were working hand in fist, and Hugh DeLacy then took off to China. So he was a Chinese silver master, a communist spy. That's the history of Leon Panetta. Of course, with our Mockingbird media, which has been taken over, over a long time, to the point that it's truly the Truman Show. And if people understand what the Truman Show was, it's a fake existence where you're being told, you're being fed lies constantly. Well, our media, Donald Trump has had the temerity, and it's just been brilliant, that he's come out and tagged it as fake news, because, oh boy, is it. What we hear from CNN, the blather coming out every day is something that one would expect out of the Truman Show, where nothing is real, and they simply feed people garbage and expect them to believe it. As they sit there and lie out of the mainstream media, and it's interesting. I mean, these people, Snowflakes doesn't begin to cover the way they are melting down on air, as they cover Donald Trump and tell lie after lie after filthy lie. It's interesting to watch them. Over the last 2.5 years and $35 million, Robert Mueller conducted this witch hunt, this investigation, starting out with a dossier, a vile dossier, to smear Donald Trump as having, canoodled with Russian hookers in a hotel room, which the story, frankly, was so outrageous about Russian hookers and urine. It's almost amusing knowing that Trump is a germaphobe. These people aren't just enemies of the state, they're idiots. The idea that they would come up with a filthy story like that and try to paint a germaphobe with that kind of information, which has now been proven that entire dossier was not only paid for by the Clinton campaign, but it was collaborated and put in place into the Mockingbird mainstream media with the likes of our once glorious FBI, and working with the likes of David Korn. And So the whole downstream of taking that story to destroy a U.S. president who with his father were virulent anti-communists. It's interesting looking back at Donald Trump's history. I'm sure you know the story of McCarthy and the hearings, and they always are now referring to McCarthyism. Well, McCarthy was exactly right. McCarthy was outing the communists that had come in and infiltrated our entire government on every level. But it's worth noting, in fact, we have a piece on our website, which, by the way, my website is theamericanreport.org, and Alan's is 1776channel.com. We wrote a piece on Woodward and Bernstein. And truly, until we looked into the history of Woodward and Bernstein, it was quite interesting to understand not only, talk about the deep state, not only did Carl Bernstein's parents, how many people know that Carl Bernstein's parents were collaborating and working with the Rosenbergs, the very people who stole our atomic secrets and gave them to Russia? Carl Bernstein's parents, he wrote a book about them. And in the book, he told how they would work with the Sobels, Sobel was also prosecuted with the Rosenbergs. He went to Alcatraz for 35 years, but he lived to come out and give an interview. And he told that he was glad he had done what they'd done. In fact, he'd done much more. They had turned over all sorts of secrets on our planes and all sorts of the entire, war machine that is used to protect the United States. And Sobel told that they had done this. He confirmed everything that he and the Rosenbergs had done. I don't think Carl Bernstein ever expected he'd come out of prison and give an interview to the New York Times. In doing so, he confirmed that Carl Bernstein's parents were working with the Rosenbergs, but also the Rosenberg sons who had worked with the communist mayor now of New York, proclaiming their innocence. Well, Sobel came forward and said, nope, we did everything and more. We did even more. And he started bragging of the things that they had done to the United States. It's interesting to understand, too, that what they did had far-reaching implications. We would not have been working and brought into Vietnam. The whole story that we were only there for some of the reasons that some people cite is not true. We had to go into Vietnam because the Soviets were backing them, and we now knew that they had the atomic information and that they could go nuclear. And so that was part of what we covered in that paper. But beyond which, the Meyer family. So understanding who they were that hired Carl Bernstein. So understanding that is that the Meyer family, they in fact were the patrons. You mentioned Saul Alinsky. They were the patrons of Saul Alinsky, the communist who wrote Rules for Radicals and was Hillary Clinton's mentor. So the fact that these were the people funding Saul Alinsky, the owners of the Washington Post, is most interesting. So it made perfect sense for them to be hiring the likes of Carl Bernstein, a kid who was bragging about, protesting for the Rosenbergs. Beyond that, understanding the Meyer family, that he was at one time the head of the Federal Reserve, the IMF. Yeah, this is a very deep state family.
Well, and Mary, this you're connecting a lot of dots here, but the fact is, I think I know that most Americans have no idea how deep the deep state runs, and frankly, those of us that are pretty much in the know, I'm surprised how deep the deep state is. I didn't realize how close they were to total control of every aspect of our national government, and I've only found out over the last really since Donald Trump was elected, just exactly how insidious and how total the whole process was.
Yeah, they've exposed themselves and unveiled who they are. It's worth mentioning. I'm not just talking about the Meyers, who were the patrons of Saul Alinsky. Imagine that. The Meyers are the parents to Katharine Graham. And interesting is all this is being exposed, that they brought out a movie, about this hero, Katharine Graham. That's just nonsense. She was working with the CIA, working closely with the CIA. Really, the Washington Post seems to be the paper of record for the CIA. Cord Meyer, that married the part of the family, was was in the CIA, and he was the one who developed the Mockingbird. And so this idea of having the press just continuously feed false information, that was in fact from Cord Meyer of the Meyer family of the Washington Post, related to Katharine Graham.
Yeah, it's and that is a real similar story to the New York Times. The New York Times has had a very, very strong communist presence, literally almost since the beginning.
Yeah, well, it has. But, Dan, you understand really better than anyone the incursion, that began into this country early on, but it really blossomed going into the FDR administration, and this communist infiltration didn't just go into certain segments of government. They went into every segment of government. They went into our trying to be in our military. Certainly, our intelligence, the entire intelligence complex has John Brennan, avowed communist, did not just end up as the head of the CIA. That's unfortunately throughout our government, and it's throughout the media complex. It's throughout Hollywood. McCarthy was right, and one of the reasons that they so worked against Donald Trump was because they knew that he was very involved with that whole McCarthy era. He and his father were virulent anti-communists, because they understood that it takes away the rights of freedom and capitalism and destroys the Constitution, and that they were working with Roy Cohn, who was the attorney to McCarthy. It's an interesting story. He was working also as the attorney for the Trump family. He was a mentor to Donald Trump. But the story that we write about in the Shady Watergate Reporters is that what happened was it wasn't not really McCarthy that brought the story forward. The person who got really interested in all this infiltration of communism was, in fact, Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon was involved with Whittaker Chambers. Now, if anyone's read Whittaker Chambers' book Witness, it's a marvel, because it really takes you through the mindset of being brainwashed into communism, and then all of a sudden coming around and understanding the evils of this system. And Whittaker Chambers was working with Alger Hiss and other communists that had infiltrated our government. As I said, at so many levels. Alger Hiss was put on trial. He was really about to skate and not get any charges. In fact, he received 4 years. It was nothing for lying under oath, for perjury charges. And Whittaker Chambers came forward, and he gave to Nixon what's known as the Pumpkin Papers. Whittaker Chambers had all the proof of these communists who had infiltrated our government, including Alger Hiss. So he brought those papers to Richard Nixon, and as a congressman. Nixon then, he brought McCarthy into the picture. McCarthy was not the lead on this. In fact, it was Richard Nixon working with Whittaker Chambers to expose this. Now, we did not know and frankly, the reason that they went after the whole Watergate scenario, which we're looking at Watergate Redux right now with Trump, is that this is why they so feared Nixon, because so many in power were communist. And so they knew that he was the one that was digging out, that was cutting this infection out of the system, that was going to destroy and expose communism. That is why they went after Nixon. Nixon was the one who was exposing it. McCarthy was part of that, but Nixon is the one who had taken the lead in exposing Hiss. And those pumpkin papers, they're called the pumpkin papers because Whittaker Chambers had hidden the papers, all the proof positive of these communists who were working inside government and their communications, and he had hidden them in a pumpkin on his farm. And so revealing all this documentation exposed all the communists inside of government. So you can imagine now understanding who the people were from the Washington Post who were looking to expose Nixon in this Watergate fiasco. And people, they look back at Watergate and they think it was this terrible thing. If you look at the things that happened under Obama, that's a joke. They needed to remove Nixon from office.
Right.
Part of the reason some say is because also the heavy influence that Kissinger had over Nixon as well, particularly as he opened up China with George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, Mary, you mentioned Alger Hiss, and I think a lot of people remember that name, but very few people realize that the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, which was the conference where the United States delegates drew up the architecture for the United Nations. They put together the plan for it, and of the 15 delegates that were at that conference, 12 of them were either communists or members of the radical left, and so as a result, CFR members, a lot of them too. So as a result, the UN architecture is based on a communist system, and it always was, and it always has been. And I think that's the main reason the John Birch Society has been so adamant about exposing what the UN is all about. And incidentally, Alger Hiss, who, as you mentioned, was spent 4 years in prison, and was proven later when with the fall or so-called fall of the Soviet Union that he was in fact under the direct pay of Stalin and was a spy for the Soviets. He was also the first Secretary General of the United Nations. He was the first guy they elected to fill that position, and I always found it fascinating that the head of the United Nations has a Soviet title as the head of the United Nations. So that gives you a pretty good idea of the direction of that.
Well,
I just thought I need to throw that in.
Oh, absolutely. And this chapter in history is really the keystone to much of what we watch today. And understanding Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White, Harry Dexter White was Morgenthau's son's best friend. Harry Dexter White, when he was brought before the committee and to testify, supposedly went home and killed himself that night. I think I don't know if he, had a heart attack and killed himself or if he was Breitbarted, let's say. But what was interesting with all of this is so people suspected much of, the things of those who were involved and how infiltrated that they had been, the Soviet silver masters, who were managed by a Soviet general. And Elizabeth Bentley, when she flipped and started turning on people and exposing them, was doing an incredible service to our country. But not until the mid-1990s. Now think about this. This had gone on from under FDR.
Mary, I don't want to interrupt, but I hear the break coming up, and I want to make sure you've got a good opportunity to say the whole statement. So let's just pick this up on the other side of the break. Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Today my guests on the radio program are Mary Fanning and Alan Jones, and we're talking about how the country and our security apparatus and our deep state has taken over this country, and what we need to do about it. And Mary, I'm sorry I had to break in and stop you before the break, but go ahead and continue with your thoughts on this.
Well, it's important to understand that while Alger Hiss served 3.5 years in prison of his sentence, it was not until the and he proclaimed his innocence forever. And so, as I said, this all came out of a charge of, that Whittaker Chambers had said he had been involved in espionage. And when he told on the radio, his suit turned around and sued him in a defamation lawsuit. So, as we came into the 90s, it was important to understand that there was an encryption code that they were using, these Soviet silver masters, that had never been able they were never able to break the code. It was an interesting code. They never once reused any letter. And so not until the mid-1990s was that code broken. Interesting, it was almost all women who had a flair for mathematics that were working on the code, and the code was broken. And what it revealed was that Hiss was far, far more injurious to this country and much greater spy and weapon than anyone had understood. But it also revealed that the Communist Party USA was in fact directly working for the Soviet Union. And it also exposed that Alger Hiss, he went to Moscow and he had a full military parade welcoming him then. And so with cracking open that code, so much became known in the Venona papers. When those secrets were exposed, that told us so much, that it was so much more malignant than anyone had imagined. Concerning Harry Dexter White. Now, they all lived under code names, so really only 10% of them were ever exposed. Did we ever even understand who had done what? Interestingly, we had written a piece, Clues to Barack Obama's Mysterious ID, and it was so interesting because we started tracking down different people that were working with Barack Obama and with the Obama campaign, and that revealed that Obama, Frank Marshall Davis, and Valerie Jarrett's mother, father, grandfather, that her entire family was very involved with the Soviet silver master Alfred Stern. Alfred Stern was a Soviet spy who was married to Madeline Dodd, and he had come into Chicago, and he had partnered in low-income housing, which is interesting. A lot of times that's not been the only case where spies are working feeding and funded off of the system, particularly in low-income housing. And it exposed that Valerie Jarrett's family was working with Alfred Stern, this Soviet spy. When that was exposed, Alfred Stern and his wife left, first to Prague and to the Soviet bloc. They eventually settled and lived in Cuba with their son until their death. The same time that Alfred Stern was exposed is when Valerie Jarrett's father claimed that there was racism at the hospital that he was working in, and he left to Iran at that point in time. So she was born in Iran at Namazi Hospital, and so she comes from a family steeped in communism, not only communist beliefs, but in fact working with Soviet communist spies. Now, of interest is that Valerie Jarrett's father-in-law is Vernon Jarrett, who was Frank Marshall Davis's writing partner at the Chicago Defender. And Vernon Jarrett was also, like Frank Marshall Davis, Barack Obama's mentor from his youth, he was also on the FBI index is an S1, is a security risk, an S1, the top security risk, to be arrested should we break into war. That these people were the most malignant in our country and the most dangerous. At that point, that's when Frank Marshall Davis moved to Hawaii and was working with the Longshore Union in order to turn Hawaii over to the Soviets.
That's amazing. And, that's the part about these programs that I find so fascinating, is because you really do have the names, the faces, the dates, everything connected. And that comes from your years and years and years of research on these subjects. And this is the kind of information that the American people need to understand, because you are really providing something that you won't find hardly anywhere else. Alan, I want to get you into the conversation. You've been hanging in there, and I want to get you on the conversation as well. So, I'd like to hear your perspective as a writer on what, some of the things that you've discovered about all these attacks on President Trump.
Well, thank you for bringing us back on the program today. It's always great to be here. It feels very familiar, and so you've got a great audience. It's a pleasure to be able to share a little bit of our work with your listeners. So what I wanted to point out was that the panic that we're beginning to see in the House of Representatives and in these former Obama administration officials, I'm talking about John Brennan and James Comey running around, it seems to be sort of frenetically from network studio to network studio, pitching their version of events. And then if you look at the look of panic in people like Adam Schiff and these other Democrats who are leading the charge, calling for, despite the findings of the Mueller investigation that was not able to find evidence of collusion, they're still charging forward with impeachment talk. This is much more than just about the 2016 election. This is much more than just about President Trump's term in office currently. I believe, and I think Mary probably would agree, this is about a possible existential threat to this communist cabal, which has been operating on some level since 1917 in the U.S. and really got a foothold in the 1940s and the 50s, almost got routed out by McCarthy and by his attorney, Roy Cohn, but managed to survive another day, regrouped, got further entrenched under the Carter administration, under the Clinton administration, then under Obama, and really thought they had America in the bag. They thought it was a done deal. This country was finished. They were just in desperation to get rid of the Republic, just fold us into world communism. Along comes Donald Trump, and I don't think they fully saw what was coming. I think they were concerned enough that they were planting the seeds to take him down. We're working on some kind of operation to frame him, but they really went into full panic when he won the election. And the panic wasn't that they stole the election. I believe the panic was, we're going to be exposed as communists that tried to overthrow the country, and we're in the fight of our lives.
Yeah, Alan, I think you're right. It appears to me that they are the viciousness and the level of I don't know. I guess it's a shrillness in the whole process that tells me that this is literally a fight to the death, and we need to make sure that we respond accordingly, because we don't have that many more chances to save this country.
Well, imagine that you're a politician. You've been an incumbent in either the Senate or the House of Representatives. You might be a man, you might be a woman. You've been there for 20, 30 years at least, maybe longer. You're on all the top committees, but you have a problem. You're a foreign agent. You've been working with intelligence services, maybe from the Soviet Union and Russia. Maybe you've been working with Chinese intelligence for a very long time. You were able to get away with it because there were friendly administrations who were basically nodding and winking or on the same team as you. All of a sudden, a new sheriff shows up in town. You've got Donald Trump bringing in his own team. And you know that Trump and Trump's father were active in anti-communist movements, the connections to Roy Cohn, and you go into a panic because you don't want to be the next Rosenbergs, the next long-term communist agent that gets routed and exposed and put on trial in front of the whole country. And I think there's a whole bunch of politicians who are sitting in that seat right now, and they're sweating, and they're desperate, and they're cornered, and there's no telling what they'll do.
No, you're right, and I have to say that the Bush family were hugely globalists, and they're part of this process too. Maybe not quite as openly as the Clintons and as the Obamas, but we've had a problem in this country for a long time, and it's called progressivism. And there are an awful lot of people in the Republican Party that are part of this progressive movement and have been for a long time. And that's what we're fighting. We've had a two-party system in this country forever. And the fact is, both parties have been co-opted. There's a number of people in the Republican Party who are more independent and, good red-blooded Americans. There's no question about that. But the damage has been done to the Republican Party because of the neocons who profess to be conservative, profess to be free market people and so forth, and then they turn around and vote with the radical left. And that has created a real problem for the Republican Party, because there's a lot of people that understand the emperor has no clothes. This is, it's a system that is corrupt from top to bottom.
Well, I think the panic is going on not only in the Senate and the Congress, mostly in the Democrat Party, but there may be Republicans are also nervous, but I think there are also people in the intelligence agencies, CIA, FBI, they're looking around and they're looking over their shoulder and they're starting to think, there may be more Robert Hansons here. There may be more moles, there may be more foreign agents who have reached the highest pinnacles of positions in the intelligence agencies, and we may have been compromised, not just a couple times, but we may have been compromised for decades. And it's not really clear how much damage has been done to our national security, but it might be really, really bad.
Yeah, I think it's extensive. And you mentioned that, and then we also, on top of that, we have all of the administrative agencies who have been writing legislation, even though they're not supposed to. They've been creating a whole new set of laws and rules and regulations that the average American has to abide by, and many of these people are just as radical to the left as some of the leadership positions.
Well, if you ever look at books like the Perestroika Deception by Globalism, or his other book, New Lies for Old, he talks about he defected. He was a Soviet intelligence officer who defected to the U.S. and then ended up working closely with the CIA. And in one of his books, I don't remember which one it was, if it was New Lies for Old or Perestroika Deception, he explained that the CIA had been really overrun by communist agents, that there was a lot of Cuban agents that got in there and others. And it's been a while since we've seen a major takedown of a foreign agent. I mean, everybody knows, Robert Hansen, Ames, these big names that you see the TV specials about, on the military channel or the history channel about, how we caught these spies. But we haven't seen any of those in a long time. Under Obama, they supposedly took down this little cell operating up in New York City and Washington, D.C., and they all got pretty much like free flights back to Moscow. I mean, we didn't even really process the crime scene and prosecute. So there hasn't been any major espionage prosecutions here for a long time. And you look at who's been running the show, and I think we're really very overdue for that. And I think they're afraid the prosecutions might be coming.
Well, I keep hearing about the level of grand jury indictments that are out there ready to be served, and I'm a little nervous about that because if they're out there and they really have teeth, we ought to be using them. And Mary and I talked about that yesterday. The fact that all these there's something like 75,000 of these indictments out there ready to be processed. A few of them, I guess, are in the works right now. But I hope that's not just pablum to lull us into thinking that things are going to happen that aren't really going to happen. Mary, I'd love to hear you respond to that, because I know your feelings on that are as strong as mine.
Well, Alan's exactly right. We've been so infiltrated. This is so overdue for anything to clean up. Our government, again, we don't know if there's 75,000 or 80,000 indictments, and until we see any one indictment, we won't know that anything is really being done. Now, it appears that William Barr is doing a good job. The fact that they're attacking him, makes us think that he is. But William Barr was also, he started in the CIA. So we want to make sure that something is being cleaned up. Because when you understand everything with Obama, that the people who were designing his campaign, Victor Margolin, who did all the artwork, that his father was one of the Soviet Silver Master spies. And, so understand, so here's the man who did Obama's campaign, the artwork and the design of it. He was also part of Subud, a really creepy cult that came out of Indonesia, which Obama was part of. And many intel agency people and Nazis in particular were a part of Subud. Loretta Fuddy, that handed over Barack Obama's birth certificate, was not only a member of Subud, but she was in charge of Subud USA. It's interesting. Subud has incredible facilities the world over, magnificent facilities. And, so they appear to have a lot of money. But the fact of the matter is there's only 10,000 members worldwide. So here's this cult that Barack Obama and his mother were a part of, and that Loretta Fuddy, who provided his birth certificate, was a part of, in charge of the United States. And Victor Margolin was second in charge, who was designing Barack Obama's logos and artwork for his campaigns. And Victor Margolin, who's a Soviet specialist, and also working with others who are involved in Subud. I mean, they're antithetical to anything that we think of as American. They're in a bizarre cult that seems to be based in Islam, and most of them didn't grow up in this country. It's interesting, even today, looking at James Clapper. His father was in the military. He grew up and through high school in Germany. Barack Obama in Indonesia until he moved back to Hawaii. We don't even know how much of these stories are, in fact, correct. And so the globalists, communists, the fact is that too many of the people that are involved are not of American sensibilities, and they don't embrace them. And Alan's exactly right. Our government is, the infiltration is great, and these people, if you look into so many of the people, and there's a website that people should go look at. It's called Livable World, and Livable World goes through the people in government that are communists, and it goes over its history. And while you'll recognize so many of the names, because it's about 40% at this point, while you recognize many of the names, and you think of your reaction will be, I really thought that person was sort of odd, oddly liberal. But you have to understand that what they did, in fact, what they did was the Soviet general that was running the Soviet Silver Master spy ring, he instead said, stop joining this Communist Party. Instead, what we will do is we will start going into the states, and we will run for Congress. We will get people in the House and in the Senate, and that's where we will take control. And so they said, let's start with the small states first. And they list as one of their big wins Barack Obama's vice president, Joe Biden. And so when you understand that, that these progressives like Joe Biden had Communist Party support, then you understand the picture that you're looking at.
Well, and Mary, the thing is, we've got to, our listeners got to understand, we're not trying to be alarmist here. We're trying to be the watchman on the wall and say, wake up, this is what's been going on. And that's exactly what you're saying here.
Yeah, where are they? And as I said, part of it is because they did not break that code until the mid-'90s. You go and you look at Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. These people are so, they're globalists, but globalists, you need to understand that globalist is global communism. It's not just being a globalist. Yeah, there's people that are doing business. Business has become much more global. But, beyond that, if you're a globalist, and if, your companies are coming out of the United States, you should have some loyalty to the United States and to some of the people who helped build all these companies, not simply outsource and offshore everything for cheap labor, leaving the American people behind. And I think that's exactly what Donald Trump saw and said, you know what, we need first of all, the first thing he did was put steel back in place. You cannot have a war machine. You cannot protect your country unless you have your own steel. Interesting, of course, that Barack Obama emptied out our, cash for clunkers, give us back every car, which was what FDR built the war machine with, all that old, good U.S. steel. But also, the new cars, which, can be controlled, much as we saw with Michael Hastings.
Yeah, that's right. If you look at the way our infrastructure in this country has been changed over the last 50 years, and the fact that the globalism is transferring our wealth from this country to all these third world countries around the world, people, I don't think, realize how serious this is, because part of the thing is we've been living on borrowed money. We've been living on deficit spending. That's why we're so far upside down. And, as long as it doesn't have an immediate impact on average Americans, they tend to ignore it. And the fact is, we have gone so far the opposite direction really over the last 40 years. We've got to wake up to the reality as America is no longer the wonderful, strong country that it always has been. It looks like we've got a break coming up. We'll break, and then we'll pick it up on the other side of the break.
This is The Micro Effect. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen...
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guests on the radio show are Mary Fanning and Alan Jones. And Alan, I want to start the second hour by visiting with you about all the different programs that are part of, I guess, the transition to the New World Order. And there's climate change. There's all these different things that they have created as smokescreens, or let's say programs that force people to think as collectivists. And we've seen Agenda 21, we've seen the climate change fiasco, all this stuff. And all of it is geared to pushing us into a direction that is the exact antithesis of what American national sovereignty and constitutional republican government is all about. So I'd love to hear your perspective on all these different programs that are out there and how they all fit together.
Great question, thanks. So I think a lot of these programs really were born in the early 20th century, and they've been implemented for about 100 years so far. One of the most important ones was central banking, and we see the creation of the Federal Reserve in the early part of the 20th century, and the spread of fractional reserve banking, which is where you have these central banks which control the money and then lend the money to the different countries. And then the banking system is based on a system where depositors put money in there, but then they loan out more money than they have available, so that these banks basically are sort of like living in a fantasy world where if everyone was to suddenly withdraw all their money at the same time, the banks would collapse overnight, which is exactly what you saw happen in Cyprus recently, where they started telling people you're not allowed to go to the ATM machine and take out more than a certain amount, or maybe you can't even take anything out. And you saw that during the financial collapse when several banks collapsed, and then Wachovia almost collapsed. So we're really never that far removed from complete financial implosion, which maybe is how they want it to be. But so they've connected all these central banks together through a network of global banking. You've got the World Bank, and it's really globally controlled. And these players, they congregate at these globalist meetings like Bilderberg and like Davos. And so this global system of control has been in existence for a long time, and the financial part of it's a big part of it. I think also then they would try to set up these trade agreements, NAFTA, the TPP, which they almost pulled off, which is all part of folding us into a global system where we don't really control our own financial destiny. So I think the financial part is a big part of it. I think increasingly we're seeing infrastructure be part of that. And if you look at what the topics of discussion at a lot of these globalist meetings like Davos is, they like to talk about infrastructure and these public-private partnerships where you have governments getting together with private companies, which oftentimes aren't even private, they're actually run by foreign governments, getting together to work on infrastructure projects. And so Mary and I have been reporting for a number of years on this case about a company based in the UAE called Gulftainer, which is actually controlled by the Jafar family, which these were Saddam Hussein loyalists who were involved in the finance and production of weapons of mass destruction. And they've actually been brought in to the United States by the Obama administration under the flag of a public-private partnership and foreign investment. And we actually set up an office with a recruiter to go and recruit this sort of business, who happened to have been a fellow named Vinay Samalapalli, who was born in India, was a foreign student in Southern California, was friends with Barack Obama. They were actually roommates in Los Angeles. So you got that going on. Then you have the surveillance state, which has become really transnational. And I think you're seeing here in the case of what happened in 2016 in the dossier, it appears that there was not just a few actors inside U.S. intelligence agencies like the FBI. It wasn't just people from Hillary Clinton's network, people like Cody Shearer and other longtime Clinton operatives that were involved. But we're also seeing indications that there was possibly foreign intelligence services involved in this operation as well, possibly British intelligence, possibly GCHQ. So you have international intelligence agencies cooperating covertly to take down sovereign countries. And I think you're seeing that is what has happened during this crossfire hurricane and this Trump-Russia collusion case, where you have, maybe Russian agents feeding bogus intelligence to Fusion GPS, and they cook up this dossier story. So that's actually really looks like global communists working together cross-border to take down a country, almost like the U.S. was some sort of third world banana republic that needed to be taken down, and we were the target. So that's 3 of them. Those are the 3 that I can think of right off the bat. You mentioned the environmental thing, too. It's kind of interesting to read the history of global warming programs, because it goes back to a Maurice Strong, who's a Canadian, actually, who was involved in the oil business, and he actually ended up becoming a UN official and establishing a lot of these UN environmental organizations. But it appears the objective wasn't primarily to protect the environment, which is a very noble cause. I mean, we live on this earth, so we would hope that it would be a livable, beautiful place to live in. But it appeared to be more political. And you look at his connections to China, and he had a relative in China, her last name was Strong as well, who was good friends with Mao Zedong, spent a lot of time living in China, spent time over in the Soviet Union, met Joseph Stalin. So if you scratch the surface of some of these environmental organizations, they're not necessarily these noble organizations simply wanting to protect the environment and wildlife, but there seems to be a streak of communism and political objectives in there which need to be watched very carefully, because this can be weaponized.
Yeah, Alan, one of the things that popped into my mind when you brought up Maurice Strong, he did die in communist China about 1.5 years ago, and the reason he was in China, he was one of their financial advisors on dealing with capitalism and capital formation. He was one of their advisors on that, and the fact is he wasn't welcome back to the United States or Canada because of some of the illegal things that he had done when he was a citizen of Canada, and he had a huge ranch down in southwestern Colorado. So a lot of connections here. And I have to mention Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a very solid communist, believed very strongly in communism. And when the so-called fall of the Soviet Union occurred back in the late 80s, early 90s, Maurice Strong was brought to the Presidio, which was one of our most prestigious bases in San Francisco. And when he was brought there, he was given hundreds of millions of dollars from organizations like the Rockefeller and the Ford Foundations. And from that, he created the Gorbachev Foundation, and from that sprang the Green Cross organization. And he is considered the father of the environmental movement. But yet, if you look at the Soviet Union, when he was premier of the Soviet Union, they had some of the biggest environmental disasters in world history. Things like Chernobyl, things like the Black Sea and they had a major environmental disaster there from drying up the Black Sea, using it for irrigation water. So it's fascinating to see how many of these things are connected together. And again, I'm not to plug the name of the show, but it is all about connecting dots. And the more we look at things, the more we realize these dots connect. And incidentally, the international financial groups now who control the World Bank and many of the central banks around the world are moving very, very quickly into a cashless society that'll be 100% digital. And when they accomplish that, Katie, bar the doors, because at that point there will be no limits to what they can do electronically to manipulate the financial systems.
Well, those are great points. Interestingly, several of Maurice Strong's oil companies have actually been caught involved in all sorts of environmental disasters. So if you look at how he actually operates his business, he doesn't seem to be much of an environmentalist at all. It's also worth pointing out that some of the biggest environmental problems that we're dealing with right now actually are coming not from capitalist countries, but from communist countries. You look at, of course, the level of pollution in China. Beijing is, the air is horrible there. Mongolia, in their capital, the air is like you almost can't breathe. You look at these species that are at risk now for extinction, like the elephants and tigers, that a lot of this is going on. A lot of the problems are coming from China, communist China, where the demand for ivory has driven poaching across the planet. Laos, which of course is a communist regime, is poaching is completely out of control, and the tigers are being wiped out and then bred in these tiger farms. And the demand is actually for tiger bones and trinkets in communist China. And these communist countries, the governments are so corrupt that and a lot of them are atheists officially. So if you don't believe in God, you don't believe that God created all these to share the planet with us, you don't really have the moral foundation to really have a love for the planet and the world around us and the different species. And there's really nothing to hold back these corrupt governments and poaching that is just wiping out whatever's left of nature. I mean, America's really, I think, has set a great example for the people naturally wanting to protect their land, and the communist model is a complete disaster, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that stands out to me is how the UN is promoting the man-caused global warming and the climate change debate. They are the ones that are saying we've got to put a tax on CO2, we've got to do all these things. But at the same time, the communist countries, and in particular communist China, are their fair-haired child, and they are not required to do anything. It's only the Western countries, only the wealthier countries of the world that are required to do anything, and only then if they're free market countries.
Good point.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion, because the reality is we're living in a I hate to say it, but it's like a parallel universe from what we grew up believing in. And I think our world has changed so much in the last, certainly in 100 years, but especially in the last 30 or 40 years. And I see a lot of things going on that we honestly need to start responding to. Mary, I want to get you back in the conversation here, because we were talking about how all these financial institutions, how the money is directing so much of this. Why is it that so many of the wealthier segments of our infrastructure are wealthier donors that promote the left?
Well, because the left holds all the power now, so the money is going to follow whoever's in power. And when you're looking at globalism, I think it's important to understand that what we're looking at is the redistribution of the United States. So as we go more global, particularly when we have these far leftist radicals in power and have for a long time, they love the idea of the redistribution of the United States. It's all about power and control. And in fact, as you spoke about the global warming movement, the papers that came out of the University of East Anglia proved that all the top scientists, the global warming scientists, were lying through their teeth. They were changing the information, and they were exchanging emails talking about how they could make up stories about global warming. Well, it is very important to understand that global warming, the whole scheme comes out of Russia. It's a Gaia movement. It's the earth is God. And if you don't understand that that's Luciferian, then you don't know where they're going with all of this. This is an evil movement. Communism is an evil movement. Communism is responsible for the death of 100 million people, at least. You look at Stalin, who killed, 60 million of his own people. You look at Mao, what he did to his people, what he's doing now. The Pope going over to China. Our Pope is communist right now. He has a long history of being steeped in communism as he came out of Argentina. Jorge at one point was shipped out of Argentina because he was working with the communist government. But the fact that he went in and gave his blessings to China while they're locking up every Christian is an abomination, just an abomination. And by the way, I don't know about any of your listeners, but I am Catholic, and we usually have a new pope when the last one died, not when he gets managed into retirement or blackmailed. Mm-hmm. Which brings us to the control through the technology and to the exposure that we have done of the hammer. The hammer was a surveillance system, a very powerful surveillance system that was created by a man named Dennis Montgomery. However, the hammer, according to our military sources, and we have several, was created for the military as a foreign surveillance system. It was to go through multiple echelons of safeguards before and signed off on, including the FISA court. FISA court was founded under the Foreign Surveillance Act, so you understand that this is a foreign system. It was to be made sure that it was never turned against the American people because it was so powerful. But again, our military sources told us that Dennis Montgomery's system worked and it saved American lives. Again, only to be used for foreign purposes, never to be turned against the American people. Well, the first thing that Barack Obama did when he came into office with Brennan and Clapper was to build a parallel platform for the hammer where they were controlling it themselves. This is what's going to break out. The reason for the whole Russia collusion story is that the hammer got exposed. And so the next thing they did in order to cover that up was create this whole Russia collusion narrative in order to hide the fact that they were illegally surveilling Donald Trump and had been for years. That is at the basis of the Russia collusion story. Robert Mueller his FBI provided the computers, the supercomputers, to build the parallel platform for the hammer. Brennan, Clapper were running this thing. They had privatized it. They were bypassing all safeguards. They were using the system. The whistleblower tapes that came out and exposed it under federal judge G. Murray Snow. He's a U.S. district judge out of Arizona. When he released those audio tapes, It broke out. We broke the story out. We had initially transcribed those tapes. When President Trump came out and told he was being illegally surveilled by the last president, President Obama, we knew that was true. He came out and said that on March 4th, on March 7th, WikiLeaks dumped CIA Vault 7, which proved the existence of the hammer, spelled H-A-M-R, and as it says in WikiLeaks, pronounced the hammer, H-A-M-M-E-R. That system had put a parallel platform minus all the safeguards so that it would not be turned upon the American people, and that is exactly what Barack Obama, John Brennan, self-avowed communist, and James Clapper, God knows what happened to that man to make him so evil, turned it against the American people for power and control, for leverage and blackmail, as Dennis Montgomery told. That surveillance system was not only found to be surveilling Supreme Court justices, including John Roberts and Anton Scalia, but members of Congress, business leaders. So, thinking about this partnering between government and private industry, wonder about all those top businessmen who were being surveilled illegally, and millions of Americans. They infiltrated and looked at their bank records, they looked at their phone calls, their text messages, everything, their pictures, everything. They were using this. Think about this. John Roberts, he wrote an opinion on Obamacare. He wrote an opinion that it was completely anti having this national health care. And then his final statement, he flipped. It made no sense. His opinion, his final analysis, his final opinion had nothing to do with the analysis that he made. And so please keep in mind, by the way, that putting in national health care like that is the very first thing that Adolf Hitler did. And you might want to read about that in Richard Evans' book, The Coming of the Third Reich. This surveillance system was for leverage and control. Think of all the things, the fear that people in Congress, you saw Dianne Feinstein come forward and saying to John Brennan, "You're surveilling us. You're in my computers." And he apologized. Apologize? That does not happen in America. Oh, yeah, we're surveilling you for leverage and control. And the idea that they have the ability and that they've turned this incredible weapon, the hammer, against the American people is what will come out. That is what is going to break. You're hearing Joe DeGenova allude to this. This illegal surveillance is what they were trying to hide when they lost power. They thought that Hillary Clinton would be in and that no one would expose their massive illegal actions, their illegal, seditious, treasonous actions, including handing off our ports to, Saddam Hussein's nuclear mastermind, his scientific mastermind in charge of weapons of mass destruction, giving him a 35-year lease to our critical infrastructure where our air, space, and sea command reside, to a man who had been declared an enemy of the United States and put on the blacklist, wanted for capture or kill, yet he was given a 35-year lease. He and his family and their company, Gulf Tanner, was given a 35-year lease to Florida's Port Canaveral, bypassing the CFIUS review, the National Security Threat Analysis, putting a declared enemy of the United States in our ports is beyond a nightmare.
Yeah, you're right, Mary. I mean, this is an amazing series of discussions, and I say series because we're bringing in so many different aspects here, and it all ultimately leads to what the deep state is all about, and that is a one-world collectivist, we can call it whatever, communist, you're absolutely right, feudalist, technocratic government that will be controlled by a handful of people, and that is something that we need to stop in any way, shape, or form that we can. We need to move forward with doing that. Sounds like our break's coming up. Let's pick this up on the other side of the break. welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guests on the radio program are Mary Fanning and Alan Jones, and we've been having a fascinating discussion about how everything has been interconnected, and we have now a group of people that are in the very highest levels of our government who are trying to take down a popularly elected president who is an outsider. And he came into the system, and it was not expected. I mean, they thought they had everything controlled, where Hillary Clinton was a shoo-in, and the American people were going to be lulled into the sense that it just had to be. It had to be. Hillary was the one. And the reality is when President Donald Trump was elected to office, it threw a huge monkey wrench in the whole globalist scheme to take over everything. And that's what we're talking about now. And Mary, you were alluding to that when we went into the break.
Yeah, they had put a system of control where they had the ability to take every bit of information, to listen to everything you did, to track you wherever you are, to, this is not a whole lot different that we just saw implemented in China, where you have social credits and they decide whether you get to go to college and who gets to have a job and who gets to go to certain grocery stores. When you have that kind of control put in place by evil people like this, you cannot expect anything good to come of it. Anyone who knows the history of Hillary Clinton and the greed and avarice of these people, the Clintons, it's not just that. The Clintons go back and they're connected to not only to communism with, Alinsky being her mentor, for Pete's sake, but also Bill Clinton. He was a man who was, and I understand that many people didn't like the Vietnam War, but he actually was one who avoided service and had the audacity to go to Moscow at that time. So he was working going back, way back with Strobe Talbot. When the Soviet Union fell, it was exposed that Strobe Talbot was a Soviet influence peddler. Corey, who was involved, his brother-in-law, is the very man who brought this PP dossier to the forefront with Sid Blumenthal. These are evil people. And for the idea that these people have control through a surveillance system of every American for blackmail and leverage should scare the daylights out of everyone. Honestly, it had to be the hand of God that stopped this from going forward. There's so much more that understanding the context of these evil people. Think about what was taking place under Barack Obama. There was a genocide of Christians in the Middle East. There was not a single peep out of that man about girls being kidnapped as sex slaves, the Christian girls, or all the beheadings by ISIS. And then now that it's come out that Hillary was, in fact, arming these incredibly evil people. Imagine if they had control here.
Well, they were the lunatics running the asylum, and you mentioned Hillary, but what happened in Benghazi? There's all this evidence that's out there that indicates that they are in this right up to the top of their eyeballs in this collusion, and that it went from the bottom all the way to the very top of our government, and that's what's being exposed under the Trump administration. We just need to make sure that it continues.
Well, when we found that surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, were being given to our adversaries, that we were arming ISIS, and that the Free Syrian Army, supposedly, that John McCain was arming, was in fact the enemy. And when we found that one of those SAMs hit, fortunately when it hit, they didn't go off because it wasn't a live armament. But they not only had given all these SAMs, but with what they had given the man pads. So these shoulder launchers, that thousands of them, many thousands of them, Jason Chaffetz exposed, and he was beside himself when he heard this in Congress, that we had given these barbarians, surface-to-air missiles as well as man pads to launch them, was something that they really needed to cover up, and they did. What also was happening is out of Benghazi, they were shipping the entire cache of Gaddafi's weapons to the enemy. They were arming our adversaries. And so what was happening in Benghazi, Hillary had another server there. Think about Hillary's server, just think about her server unto itself, this illegal server with her illegal emails where she was found that she was in fact communicating with Barack Obama under an assumed name, his AKA name. Abedin exposed that these people were having a secret system where they were communicating and they were arming the enemy. It's head-spinning. No one could have imagined this sort of treason.
You're right, Mary, and the fact that people like you are exposing this puts you at personal risk. It puts me at personal risk. Those of us who are out there as the watchman on the wall, darn good and well that we're on their hit list. So if President Trump is not reelected in 2020 and we continue to move back into this globalist direction, there's going to be an awful lot of us that will be in the gulag.
If we do not, if you think President Trump, you don't like the way he articulates something, if you do not make sure that, and think about this, these people have gone into electronic computer systems and stolen votes every place. If this is not a massive wave, if the American people do not stand up and make sure, look at the likes of Kamala Harris. Could anyone have even imagined that Kamala Harris and Cory Booker and Joe Biden and people like this could take the reins of this country? If we do not take this country and hold on to it with Donald Trump, we are in the gulag. If you think they're brainwashing your children with what they're teaching in school these days, they barely talk about the founders of our country, and only, in racist terms. This is beyond dangerous. Dan, I live, where I live. Don't live in a place where we have, Chinook helicopters, but one, ripped off part of our roof. That is not the norm.
No, that's right. You've very personally experienced the sort of surveillance that we used to believe it only occurred in places like communist China.
Well, they were implementing a Soviet America. There is no doubt what they were doing. They were redistributing the country. They were putting people in place who had long radical ties. The idea that Ash Carter and Leon Panetta were in power at all. Ash Carter, people need to understand. We've written many papers, and you can search our names at the Center for Security Policy and read on Saddam's and Ash Carter and how we had a system that was developed over 13 years with billions of dollars, 95% complete. It was called the NLOS. It was missiles in a box. It was to go on our military ships. The NLOS would launch missiles out of this box. It was also to be used for the Army. Had they had it at Benghazi, instead of Ash Carter canceling it, those men would never have taken on that fire. Ash Carter canceled it, and within the month, Russia announced that they had it. Only now Russia was putting it on cargo containers, and they were. It appears to be a standard intermodal cargo container. However, it opens up via satellite, and 4 caliber missiles that can be armed with nuclear, biological, chemical, EMP, or a standard payload. Comes out of that appearing to be a standard intermodal cargo container. But the Russians are now selling this, as I said, putting them on cargo ships, putting them on things that bypass the Geneva Convention, there's no doubt. But they're arming our adversaries. And when you're handing over our ports and they have direct access into the country, this became an incredibly dangerous thing. Also, get in touch with your congressman. Who is checking every cargo container that comes into this country? Well, none other than the Chinese under Hutchison Whampoa out of Bermuda. They look at the 10%, really, which turns out is only 1.5% of cargo containers that actually do get hand-checked. The Chinese are the ones who are looking at what's in cargo containers that come into the United States. That should, Americans need to wake up. Dan, you talked about whether there are, 75,000 or 80,000 sealed indictments. We don't know that is true. Maybe that is true. We've got a man who's running the country that is, having everything they can being thrown at him. Do not imagine that he can do this all alone. The American people need to stand up and help him. No one else is coming to save us. No one is coming to save us. We are the people we are waiting for. Americans need to stand up and get very involved in their government, in their country. If they want freedom, they're going to have to fight for it.
I want to extrapolate a little bit on what Mary just said about the containers coming into the country and not being scanned. There's actually a national security component to President Trump's ramping up of these tariffs against China, which I don't think has been recognized, and that is that slapping, tariffs on almost every product now. He's going to go across the board, not just the supply chains, but also consumer products, is going to reduce, I believe, the number of containers that are coming into the country from China, and therefore that's going to reduce the workload of the number of containers that need to be scanned and looked at as potential transit points for weapons of mass destruction into the U.S. It's really overwhelming, the number of containers that come in through these major ports like Los Angeles and Long Beach every day. Now, interestingly, a study just came out that said that demand for diesel inside China is way down, which indicates that these tariffs may already be more effective than initially realized. That means that the trucks are not moving from the factories to the ports at the rates that they were before. Therefore, there are probably going to be less inbound containers coming in. That's just part of the picture, but I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I think you're right, and there's something called the Baltic Sea Index that I know at various times when we've had financial problems, like back in 2008, 2009, that Baltic Sea Index, which is basically a measurement of the number of cargo ships being sent out around the world, and that's also being impacted with this. And I think the American people need to wake up to the reality is we're buying our own rope when we're buying all these Chinese products because they're using the funding, the profits that they're getting out of these sales to build their military, to do all the things that are going to make China the strongest country in the world within the next 20 years.
That's exactly right, Dan. We are funding our adversaries with the redistribution of America, and I am so glad you mentioned the Baltic Dry Index. We cited the index when we were talking about the sell-off of our ports. If people want to understand what took place under Barack Obama, go look up the Baltic Dry Index. It truly is a snapshot of what is happening globally, what commerce is taking place around the world. under Barack Obama, the Baltic Dry Index reflected his destruction of global economies, particularly ours. And that picture tells the story.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it was amazing how radically it changed in just a matter of about 6 months to a year.
Yeah, everything was dead in the water. That was Barack Obama's economy. So all of those who, the snowflakes who think he did a great job, it defies the information that's available.
Yeah, we really are living in an interconnected global economy, whether we want it or not. It's the reality, because they've spent 100 years building this infrastructure, building the systems that force us into a global economy. And, believe me, this is not people who are promoting free market capitalism. And the one thing that people need to understand is that the globalists who are pushing this, they are monopoly capitalists. They are not free market people. And that's the reason they promote communism and promote all these different ways to control people, is because they don't believe in free markets.
No, in fact, what people need to understand is we are the engine to the global world economy. It is just that simple. We run the global economy. We make wealth every place. And what they were doing was redistributing that wealth, redistributing our factories, giving everyone except Americans jobs. And what Donald Trump decided to do was insource, bring our economy back in and work it with the American people, rather than basically being an entitlement global structure where we were carrying the load of the entire globe on the American people's backs without rewarding the American people. What Donald Trump did was when he reverse engineered what had gone on with outsourcing and globalism, and he began insourcing, the first thing he did, under Obama, you had look at the corporate tax rates, at 35, 39%. Donald Trump brought that down to 15%. And those rules and regulations were forcing our corporations outside of our borders.
Yeah, that's right. So many of these so-called free trade programs that were promoted under previous administrations, in reality, it just opened the doors to moving, offshoring all of our industry and moving all of our free enterprise offshore.
That's right, and sending and employing people, not that they were living at some glorious standard, but it was sending all of our jobs offshore as well, sending our steel offshore, sending all sorts of production out of this country, so that we were just a credit card nation, really destroying this country for its people.
Yeah, that's right, and I just in the last couple of days we've been seeing the Chinese now rattling the sabers of rare earth minerals as being something that they're going to hold over our head, because we gave up all of our rare earth mineral mining, and now the Chinese control that. That's a very good example of how we lose our strategic minerals and metals to an adversary.
Well, as well as our uranium, a national security byproduct that one has to have to protect ourselves, and we don't have that much anyway. So the idea that Hillary Clinton sold our uranium to Russia, that Robert Mueller delivered the sample, he claims it was for some other reason. These are acts of treason. There's no doubt about it. You don't hand off your critical infrastructure ports. You don't hand off a key asset like uranium. We shouldn't give them a nickel's worth of uranium. And that Bill Clinton was part of that deal, and that the Clintons got $145 million for that deal. Not only did they get that $145 million for the Clinton Foundation for the Uranium One deal. But when they handed off our ports, and the Clintons were working with the Jafars, they were working through Business Back's education, these foundations, which are all a scheme and a scam, and they were working with Varkey Gems, and as I said, the Jafars. After they signed off those ports, Varkey, which had been Varkey Gems, raised $70 billion for the Clinton Global Initiative.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The kind of money we're talking here is such an enormous amount of money. And incidentally, Mary, the fact that Uranium One, the area that they sold the rights to the Soviets and I use the term Soviets because in my mind the Soviet Union never really fully collapsed.
They just changed the name. In our last paper, we talk about Putin saying, I like communism and I like it still.
Oh yeah. It didn't go away. As a matter of fact, if you look at the number of countries living under communism today compared to when the so-called fall of the Soviet Union, it's almost double the number of countries living under communism or radical socialism today as in 1990.
Yeah, I'd ask your listeners to go to the Center for Security Policy, and we just did a new occasional paper, Not Today, Sir. The history on what we're looking at and how we used to protect our country and what is taking place and took place under the Obama administration. If you understand what took place, it is truly a nightmare beyond comprehension. But of course we have no media, so the American people are being kept in the dark.
Exactly. Well, that's why we're doing shows like this. We're almost out of time. I want to give Alan and you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the projects that you're working on.
Our newest projects we are back to the hammer and exposing more of it. What has taken place is, when we first wrote the story of the whistleblower tapes, it came out, General Thomas McInerney and Admiral Ace Lyons, two U.S. military flag officers of sterling reputation and repute, came forward and read our paper over America's airwaves. When they began releasing the text message of Strzok and Page, they had been listening, and they texted back and forth. They were very concerned that the hammer would be exposed. Now, the fact that two 4-star flag officers came forward and read that paper over America's airwaves made them sweat. The very next day, James Comey went before Congress. He told them that Donald Trump was not being wiretapped, and he opened up the Russia collusion investigation. He announced it. That was how they responded to the exposure of the hammer. So make no doubt that that's what they're trying to cover up, is this illegal surveillance system worthy of Hitler or Stalin. And everything about the Operation Crossfire Hurricane, understand that they keep what they're doing. It's the batting machine. They're throwing as much flack as fast as they can at Donald Trump, and they're turning up the speed, and they hope to cover up their illegal crimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're spot on, Alan. Any last thoughts from you?
Yes, I want to bring to attention 2 days of interviews that happened in the House of Representatives with James Baker, who was the former FBI General Counsel. And so they had 2 interviews with him just before the 2018 midterm elections. On the day 1 of his interview, Representative Jamie Raskin, who's from Maryland, who's a Democrat, asked, very carefully worded, Mr. Baker, do you have any evidence that the FBI or the Department of Justice surveilled Donald Trump for political purposes? Because Trump did say in his tweet that Obama tapped my wires at Trump Tower, and Baker said no. Then they bring him back in about 2 weeks later for a follow-up interview, same committee, and Baker interrupts at the beginning of the meeting and says, I'd like to make an additional statement on the record that I didn't bring up previously. I just now remembered in the last few days that an attorney came to me, and he had a client named Dennis Montgomery who said he was a U.S. government contractor and had media he wanted to bring to us with evidence that the U.S. government had illegally surveilled Americans, including government officials. Now, this hearing was a closed hearing, but fortunately a transcript of it was leaked by Congressman Collins, and we've now transcribed or copied sections of the transcription and revealed that Baker now is the first FBI official to go on the record to say that Dennis Montgomery brought evidence to us in the form of digital storage devices with information that he says shows that this surveillance was going on illegally. That's a very important development.
Well, we'll pick up on that, and we will have you folks back on later this summer, and hopefully we can cover that area as well. We're out of time. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in to Connecting the Dots. And Marion Allen, as always, it's been wonderful having you on, and you have connected a lot of dots for a lot of people. Thank you again, and tune in next week.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.